This is Seeker, a LitRPG serial by Leland Artra, created by text-to-audio technology.
Chapter 3: Ruins. Aiden stepped lightly in the shadows of the forest, breathing in the fresh scents of moss and pine. It was a welcome change from the acrid smoke of the forge that seemed to permeate his hair and clothes. Out here, his thoughts moved in a different pattern to the ringing beat of the forge and the soft shuffle of pages in Bram's shop. In the forest, he moved carefully, listening to the whispers of other inhabitants moving about, and thrilled to the gently touch of the wind as it flowed through the trees touched with heavy earthy aroma, plumerias, jasmine, mahogany, teak, and layers of animal musk. Following a game trail to the first trap, Aiden listened to the soothing chorus of birdsong. It was one of the reasons he had taken up trapping the creatures instead of hunting them. While their plumage could be used for many things and sold well, he could earn a bit more with a small investment of time and some supplies by taming them to be pets. He admired their grace, their colors, their voices that transformed the forest into a living choir. A trader had hinted that pets sometimes sold for more than feathers. It had taken the better part of a year, but he'd found he liked catching, taming, and then giving them to traders to sell in cities. In his mind, he saw it as a way to share a touch of the forest with people's lives. The traders paid 2 pence each for the small, colorful creatures and a whole silver chera for the larger parrots. More if they'd been trained to do small tricks like playing or coming on command. He climbed up an ancient oak to the first of his traps meant to catch the small but colorful finches or pitas. He'd put the trap on a branch about 15 feet off the forest floor, which had a second branch he could comfortably stand on while tending to it. But rather than the sight of a fluttering, iridescent captive, the trap was sprung, empty, and the sweet bait gone. Aiden pulled the trap down and cut the line connecting it to the branch, releasing the branch to snapped back. Another branch that must have been caught on it came free, and with a whipping snap showered Aiden in drops of water caught in its leaves. Aiden took a step back at the surprisingly cold water and almost dropped the trap as he grabbed for support. After he wiped his eyes clear, he laughed. The forest always had some surprise. He took a more stable sitting position in the branches and looked the trap over. It was a wire cage trap he'd made to mimic the wood and twine traps. This one wouldn't be chewed through like the others. Yet it was empty and the bait gone. How had this been done without leaving it open? He whistled in amazement and glanced around. That's the third. Aiden's brow furrowed. He had set this trap just yesterday after devising the improved design and making with small iron wires instead of twine. As a boy, he had learned to track, trap, and kill many animals with his parents, and then even more from Finn, the village's master hunter. Aiden's traps never failed. Well, until recently. He climbed over to look at where the trap had been placed. There were faint scuff marks in the bark of the branch just above where the trap had been mounted. That might mean something with strong, sharp nails had been tampering with the trap from the outside, not the inside. The bait, a mix of seeds and berries, was gone. But there were no feathers, no signs of struggle. Had the trap caught something and then been opened? The locked door indicated no. The trap had been robbed and then sprung. Aiden felt the first coils of frustration in his gut. Are birds outsmarting me? He took the trap with him to the second trap. The second trap was for bigger birds and had a door that would swing shut and lock when a bird stepped inside to get to the bait. This trap was also sprung, except a handful of creeping vine stems about a foot long each had been woven into the doorway, preventing it from closing and latching. The trap was too large to be overcome by whatever means the smaller one had, but had still been thoroughly defeated. The bait was gone and no bird to show for it. He pulled the entangling vines out of the trap door. A smaller vine broke free as he cleaned the vines from the trap, snapping away, clearly being under tension. Aiden looked up to see where it went just in time to get a faceful of water. There was a soft bird call from somewhere above him that didn't sound like any bird he knew. Only this call seemed to oscillate, and it sounded more like laughter than a bird call. Wiping his face clear of water again, he looked for the source of the unusual bird laughter. But it went silent the moment he could see clearly. Aiden waited and watched. Nothing. Finally, he reset the trap and climbed down. He'd promised a parrot to a traveling merchant, and still didn't have it. If this kept up, he wouldn't have one. Aiden's jaw tightened. He checked the remaining 3 smaller traps. Each one was the same: bait gone, trap empty. Except now he was looking for more traps and disabled 3 more water traps. They were all crude, made with the simplest of materials. None dangerous or difficult to spot. It was no longer coincidence or luck. Something or someone was deliberately freeing his quarry, and it was smart enough to set up some counter traps. But who, or more interesting, what? Sitting on a wide branch leaning against the tree trunk by the last trap, he tried to puzzle out what to do next. The shadows were stretching, but the early evening sky was still light. There were about 4 hours of good light left. Maybe I should reset the traps and then watch them from a blind, he thought. But no, he had work to do in the smithy and couldn't spend all night trying to find out what was going on. A soft flutter of wings and flash of color overhead caught his attention. Glancing up, expecting to see a finch or a sunbird, his breath caught at the flash of vibrant, shimmering feathers, a hypnotic dance of emerald, sapphire, and crimson. What kind of bird is that? Aiden straightened, his keen eyes scouring the canopy until he spotted a piece of it. A bird like none he had ever seen. It was a little smaller than a crow, and it clearly was purposefully hiding. It leaned out and regarded him with bright, clever eyes. Seeing him looking back, it chirped a bell-like sound and darted off to the northeast away from the village and deeper into the forest. Its dazzling plumage pulsed with a life all its own, brighter than the long shadows of the canopy in the late afternoon could explain. Aiden sat motionless for several seconds, watching the bird's acrobatic flight. It moved with incredible speed, soon vanishing into the cover of the trees. He slid off the branch to climb to the forest floor. He took stock of the situation. It was still early evening. He wasn't all that far from the village. Aiden wasn't worried about getting lost in the forest. He'd been moving through the woods since before his earliest memory. His father wouldn't be back this evening, so even if he was out late, no one would be worried. I should still take precautions. He cautioned himself, remembering all the advice from Finn and even his natural father so long ago. He pulled his pouch and took out a bit of paper. Using his graphite pencil, he wrote which direction he was going and that he expected to be back before dawn. Placing the paper into one of his traps, he dangled the traps from one of the trees where they'd be easily seen if someone came looking. Pulling out a piece of white chalk he used in the smithy to mark the projects, he marked a tree and set off in the direction the bird had gone. 2 things pulled at him beyond just trying to track that unusual bird. 1, there were some old ruins in that direction which he liked exploring, and 2, it had been in those ruins he'd found the broken silver token. There was just enough light left to do a little exploring, and it would be a full moon, so getting back wouldn't be difficult either. An hour later, he hadn't seen any other sign of the unusual bird, but he came to the ancient moss-covered standing stones that were some kind of old ruin. There were 12 massive stones stood in a large circle around a circular glade, and in the forest around them were the remains of stone buildings or stone walls. What had been here so long ago, no one remembered. Aiden had explored them many times since he'd found them a year ago. He immediately went through the stone circle and moved south across a small stream to the largest building he'd found so far. It had been 2 or 3 stories tall, and it was connected to what had to be the base of some wall. Only a small section 3 feet tall still stood and went some 30 feet in a straight line to the west. There were fallen stones on both sides that had clearly been part of the wall and had long since fallen. The bones of a large tree that had tumbled in some storm long ago lay through a section of the wall, being the most likely thing to have caused the wall to finally fall so completely apart. It was inside this building he'd found the silver token. He took a moment to check for bear or wolf sign. It was still odd that in all the explorations of these ruins, he'd never found any sign of the normal forest predators. In fact, it seemed even the smaller forest creatures, except for the birds, stayed away from these ruins. Finding no signs of anything large having been around, he climbed over the broken wall and into the building's interior. He'd found the silver token on the upper level, but hadn't had time to explore the lower areas since then. With the little light, he was able to see there wasn't much to explore. A small space filled with the crumbled remains of the stonework from above was all he could see. Moving about, he found a way through the lower floor to the other side. That yielded something more interesting, a stone staircase leading down. He examined it closely. A few steps down, it grew too dark to see, but the moss and plants only covered the first few feet. Past that, it seemed to turn to a gray stonework. He pulled his little camping candle lantern from his pouch. It took a few strikes on the flint, but he got the candle lit and closed the glass door of the lantern to keep the breeze from blowing out his light. Holding it high, he slowly moved down the stairs. With each step, he checked the next step for stability, the walls and ceiling for any sign of possible collapse. The stairs led a surprisingly distance underground, and as he moved, the steps became more and more clean. The musty smells of the forest faded behind him, until he felt the simple chill of being in a deep underground chamber and the smell of dry old stone. The stairs ended in a small alcove with a pair of doors made of some black material. He touched it. They felt chill, but not the cold of metal, nor the shallow warmth of an old hardwood. One of the doors stood open. As he looked, the hinges caught his attention. They were smooth and cleanly inset into the doorframe and doors. There were 3, and they looked strong and very well made. They were attached, but there were no screws or nails, only smooth rectangular plates connected by hinges. He stepped close and held his light past the open door and saw some kind of inlaid pattern on the floor. Kneeling, he saw there was a pair of concentric circles of silver in the polished, smooth, deep blue stone floor. But what caught his attention was that the 2 circles formed a band in which he recognized the symbols, which matched the reverse of the token he'd found. Standing, he slowly stepped into the room. His light barely lit the space, but he could make out it was a smallish, circular room of maybe 8 feet across. The 2 inlaid bands and symbols formed an inner circle of about 6 feet diameter. In the center of the room, a pile of something about 3 feet tall, dark, and dusty sat. There were no other apparent doors. Aiden moved in closer and crouched down to examine the pile. At first, he couldn't figure it out, but when he gingerly reached out to touch it, it clattered to the floor sideways, revealing itself as a human skeleton in long, deteriorated clothing. Aiden screamed and lurched back, dropping his lantern, which crashed, broke, and went out, leaving him in complete darkness. He fell sideways and banged his head on the floor hard enough he saw stars in the dark. Blinking, he felt the back of his head, cursing his stupid reaction. He was going to have a heck of a bump. Feeling his way, he carefully sat up and felt around till he found the remains of his lantern. It wasn't expensive, but it wasn't cheap either. He cursed, feeling for the pieces till he found the hot wax and the remains of the small candle. Crossing his legs, he started feeling in his pouch for his flint and steel. The back of his head had to have been hit hard because he was still seeing stars. 10 stars flickered in the air. Stopping, he blinked and put his hands in front of his eyes. He wasn't seeing stars in his head. He was seeing stars in the room. His eyes had adjusted slightly to the dimmer light, and there were 10 glowing stars arranged in a circle. They didn't move, but they did flicker slightly. They were golden points of light, not as bright as a candle, but together they were almost a quarter of a candle strength. Standing, he found they were all at the same height, just above his head, maybe 7 feet in the air, and spaced evenly in a circle around the area. He realized with a start they were over the inscribed circle. Carefully, he reached out to feel one. It had no substance at all. No heat nor cold came from them. His hand could pass through them easily, and momentarily they'd be inside of his hand. But he felt nothing. It was odd. He could see the light coming from inside his hand. As he moved, the light would shine brighter, showing bone and blood vessel shadows. The light was still not good enough, so finally he bent and relit his candle. Then he used the base of the lantern to hold the candle with 3 of the panes still mostly in place. It would be enough to get out. With the candle lit, the stars were not as bright, but knowing they were there, he could see them clearly. Moving to the skeleton, he knelt but didn't touch it. He couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. Looking closer, he realized it probably wasn't a human after all. It wasn't bone white, but made of a bluish crystal. This person had been kneeling when they died and then just slowly deteriorated undisturbed until now. Gaining a bit more courage, Aiden lifted the ragged edges of the cloak. The person had some kind of cloth armor with silver studs. Only the tattered armor was now so threadbare he was sure he could just pluck the silver studs without any resistance. The dried leather belt and clips held a short sword, except the short sword's leather-wrapped handle looked practically new in comparison to the dried and twisted leather sheath and belt. Aiden pulled the short sword free. It was made of a good spring steel, clean lines with a trefoil blade, and it looked as if it had just been forged. There was a rotted coin purse with 6 pence, 21 silver chera, and 18 silver crosses. The blade had to be worth at least 300 silver crosses. If he took the silver studs, there'd be probably another 10 ounces of silver. This person had been very wealthy indeed, but why was this person here, and what did it die of? He thought about taking the silver studs, but although the coins and the sword seemed okay, something felt wrong about pulling apart this person's armor for its bits and bobs. He'd already gotten far more than he'd ever held at once. Maybe he could come back with a spade and dig a proper grave for this person. He moved to stand, putting his hands down to push up from the floor with, when his hand pressed into something soft with beads or heavy embroidery. He looked down and found a small, dark brown alms purse that had probably been around this person's neck. The purse was a soft leather with a pattern burned and embellished with embroidery and wooden beads. Unlike the sword, it looked old and heavily worn, however. Like the sword, it wasn't damaged by time. He picked it up, and its decorated pattern had a circle band with the same symbols as those inlaid into the floor here, and on the half-silver token he and Bram had been looking into. In the center of the circle was a unique symbol holding one 5-point star at its center. He put the sword in his belt, the coins in his own coin purse, and the alms purse into his pouch. Looking around the room, he started to leave, but stopped. Turning back, he spoke softly. "I'll see about getting you a proper burial." He then climbed back up the stairs to waning light of evening.
Want more? Check out reamstories.com/seeker. Thank you for listening. Before you go, please like, subscribe, and comment. I'd love to hear your comments on these stories, good or bad. These audio readings are produced with text-to-audio technology to keep costs down. To support producing these with greater quality and frequency, leading to the ability to use voice actors, there are 2 options. Option 1, and my personal favorite, go to reamstories.com/seeker and follow or subscribe to get early access, participate in the amazing community of listeners and fans, and thus support the writing, editing, and audio production. Or, Option 2, go to patreon.com/LARTRA and become an audio production patron. Subscriptions sustain the serial writing projects and all their associated costs. Again, thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this audio production.